Prisons were never built with mercy in mind. Their architecture is cold, their purpose unforgiving. But what history and reality have shown us is far darker than the mere denial of liberty. Across the world, prisons have evolved, or perhaps devolved, into mirrors of cruelty, chaos, and human collapse. They are not sanctuaries of reform. They are arenas where despair is sharpened into a weapon, where punishment becomes not just the loss of freedom, but the erosion of self. Behind steel doors and razor wire, survival itself is a privilege. Some of the inmates forget the rhythm of sunlight, the sound of another human voice, the sensationals. Or is it the governments and guards who enforce punishment with corruption, cruelty, or apathy? Perhaps the truest answer lies in the bricks and the filth themselves. Rotting over the windswept border of Kazakhstan, in the remote Russian town of Soleletsk, stands a fortress of despair whose reputation has traveled far beyond its walls. Officially titled Penal Colony No. 6, its moniker comes not from its inmates or its staff, but from a statue at the entrance, a crude black sculpture of a dolphin, bent in a grim parody of playfulness. To casual visitors, it may seem harmless, almost whimsical, but to those who know what lies within, the figure is an emblem of irony, mocking the misery behind the gates. Inside live Russia's most feared criminals, serial killers who preyed without remorse, cannibals who consumed their victims, terrorists whose crimes shook nations, and collectively they are said to have killed thousands. For them, there will be no appeals, no paroles, no second chances. Black Dolphin is not a stop on the road of punishment. It is the end of the road itself. In most prisons, even the harshest, inmates carve out tiny refuges of survival. Stolen conversations, a moment in the yard, a brief chance to rest. At Black Dolphin, as if the state seeks to own not only the prisoner's body, but his every twitch and gesture. The message is relentless and absolute. You own nothing here, not even yourself. Then there is the rule of posture, perhaps the most infamous regulation of Black Dolphin. For 16 hours each day, inmates must remain standing or pacing. They are forbidden to sit or lie on their bunks during daylight hours. Imagine years of aching muscles, of legs trembling under constant strain, of spines stiffening into unnatural minds begin to fracture. Deprived of contact, of comfort, of the smallest spark of humanity, men begin to lose themselves. They become shadows of their former selves, trapped in a timeless monotony until life itself drains away. In the beating heart of Bangkok, where streets overflow with noise, markets, and neon lights, sits a fortress of despair that locals and foreigners alike whisper about with dread. Its official name is Bangkok Central Prison, but to many it is known with bitter irony as the Bangkok Hilton. The nickname, of course, mocks the truth. There is nothing luxurious about this place. Behind the walls crowned with rusting barbed wire, men are not pampered. They are slowly broken down, body and spirit, in one of the most suffocating environments on Earth. Bangkok was originally designed for about 3,500 inmates. Today, it houses more than twice that number, sometimes pushing beyond 8,000. The overcrowding is so extreme that cells built for 25 men are often crammed with 60 or more. Prisoners lie shoulder to shoulder on bare concrete floors, without mattresses, without blankets, and without relief from the punishing tropical heat. In Thailand's sweltering climate, the cell blocks turn into ovens, where sweat mixes with sewage and disease into a stifling fog. Buckets serve as toilets, and the stench seeps endlessly through the walls, coating the air in filth that clings to skin and lungs alike. Perhaps the most infamous feature of Bangkok is the use of leg irons. For the first 3 months of incarceration, every single inmate, regardless of crime, is forced to wear heavy shackles around their ankles. The metallic clinking of chains becomes the soundtrack of the prison, echoing endlessly through corridors. For those on death row, the punishment, their fates are sealed. For some, the punishment stretches into decades. For others, the final sentence is death. Life inside Bangkok is a slow, grinding nightmare. Overcrowding fuels tension. Arguments erupt over food rations, over access to water, or over inches of space on the hard floor. Violence is never far away. Guards enforce order with intimidation, often relying on fear rather than fairness. Corruption festers openly. Those with money can bribe their way to small comforts, while the poor are left to suffer, unprotected and vulnerable. Drugs and weapons find their way inside, smuggled through bribery, turning survival into a dangerous gamble. What makes Bangkok so cruel is not sudden massacres or spectacular riots, but the relentless erosion of humanity. The chains on ankles, the suffocating heat, the overcrowding, the despair. These are the tools that grind men down. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years, until memory of freedom is replaced by an endless present of suffering. To enter the Bangkok Hilton is not to serve a sentence. It is to begin disappearing, slowly, painfully, until nothing is left but a shadow of what once was human. In southeastern Turkey, in the city of Diyarbakir, stands a prison that has carved itself into the nation's memory as a monument to cruelty. At first glance, its concrete walls and watchtowers may seem no different from any other prison. But to those who know its history, the very name Diyarbakir Prison is synonymous with terror. It is not simply a facility of confinement. It became for a time a laboratory of repression, where human dignity was systematically destroyed. The transformation began after Turkey's 1980 military coup. What had once been a detention center for ordinary criminals turned into an instrument of political control. Inside its walls, thousands of prisoners, many of them Kurdish activists, intellectuals, and dissenters, were subjected to a program of dehumanization so intense that survivors would later describe it as hell on earth. Between 1981 and 1984, Diyarbakir became a place where brutality was not the exception, but the rule. Torture was woven into daily life. Beatings were constant, but they were only the beginning. Prisoners were subjected to electric shocks, forced submersion. In Diyarbakir, the prison itself became a battlefield of cultural annihilation. Psychological warfare ran alongside the physical torment. Prisoners were made to crawl like animals, bark like dogs, or sing military anthems until their voices broke. Those who resisted were dragged into solitary confinement cells, tiny, dark, and filthy spaces where the mind could unravel in silence. Hunger strikes erupted as acts of desperate defiance, but many who joined them did not survive. Others chose another escape, suicide, the only way left to end the endless cycle of humiliation and pain. The toll was staggering. Dozens of inmates died under torture, starvation, or untreated disease. Hundreds more carried permanent physical scars. All carried invisible ones. Survivors described waking nightmares, lifelong trauma, and an enduring sense of loss. Diyarbakir was not just a prison, it was an assault on the human spirit itself. Its legacy has outlived the military rule that empowered it. In Turkey, Diyarbakir remains a symbol of state brutality, especially in the collective memory of the Kurdish people. It reminds the world that the most dangerous than Venezuela's La Sabaneta prison reveals the other extreme, the total collapse of order. Located in the oil-rich city of Maracaibo, this prison was designed for just 700 inmates. But at its peak, more than 3,700 men were packed within its crumbling walls. Overcrowding so severe transformed the facility into something closer to a war zone than a place of incarceration. The guards themselves, outnumbered and poorly equipped, patrolled the periphery but rarely dared to enter the cell blocks. Inside, authority belonged not to the state, but to gangs. Inmates formed their own governments, complete with leaders, soldiers, and tax day. Witnesses spoke of hacked bodies, blood-soaked floors, and chaos so complete that even seasoned guards described it as resembling a battlefield rather than a prison. But violence in La Sabaneta was not confined to large riots. It was a daily occurrence. In some years, more than 500 prisoners died inside its walls, a death toll that rivaled active war zones. Corpses sometimes lay in hallways for hours, untouched, as no one dared to claim them until the killing stopped. To live here was to accept that death could come at any moment, over a scrap of food, a disputed debt, or simply being in the wrong place when violence erupted. The physical conditions made survival even more impossible. The prison's infrastructure, built for hundreds, collapsed under the weight of thousands. Raw sewage flowed through hallways, disease spread unchecked, and food was scarce. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and HIV claimed lives silently, while machetes and bullets claimed them violently. Hammocks were strung over bunks, a space where the government's reach ended at the gates. The prison became a mirror of Venezuela's wider struggles: corruption, poverty, and decay. La Sabaneta was not just a prison, it was a warning, a glimpse of what happens when the state abandons its duty of care and punishment devolves into savagery. Here, survival was not about serving time. It was about staying alive one more night, in a place where humanity itself was swallowed by chaos. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, once stood a prison so vast and infamous that it became a dark landmark in Latin American history. Known as Carandiru Penitentiary, it was built in the 1950s to hold about 3,000 men. But like so many prisons in the developing world, its population exploded over the decades into slow-moving death penalties. To be imprisoned at Carandiru was to live with a constant awareness that disease might kill you, even if violence didn't. The prison was also a cauldron of tension. With too few guards to maintain real control, gangs filled the vacuum, shaping daily life inside. They smuggled in drugs and weapons, enforced their own rules, and punished disobedience with brutal efficiency. Guards, overwhelmed and often corrupt, looked the other way, allowing violence to fester just beneath the surface. This simmering chaos erupted catastrophically on October 2nd, 1992. A fight broke out between rival gangs in one of the cell blocks. It escalated quickly into a riot, with inmates arming themselves with knives, shanks, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Guards, unable to contain the chaos, called in Sao Paulo's military police to restore order. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in prison history. The police stormed Carandiru with overwhelming force. Armed with rifles and shotguns, they moved cell by cell, firing at inmates in a campaign that survivors later described as indiscriminate slaughter. Some prisoners surrendered with their hands raised, only to be shot at point-blank range. By the end of the day, 111 prisoners lay dead. Many were executed after already giving up. The massacre shocked Brazil and the world, exposing not just the brutality of the police response, but the decades of neglect and corruption that had made such a tragedy inevitable. The aftermath of Carandiru was complicated. International human rights groups condemned the massacre as an atrocity. Within Brazil, however, public opinion was divided. To some, the prisoners were irredeemable criminals who got what they deserved. To others, the massacre was proof of a failed system, a government so incapable of controlling its prisons that its only response was overwhelming violence. Carandiru was eventually closed and demolished in 2002. Today, its grounds host a public park and cultural center, a place of recreation, standing on the soil of one of the worst prison massacres in modern history. But the ghosts of Carandiru linger. Its story remains a warning about the deadly mix of overcrowding, neglect, and unchecked authority. Mexico's answer to decades of prison scandals. For years, the nation's penitentiaries had been plagued by corruption, riots, and brazen escapes, some involving tunnels, others involving guards who simply opened the gates. El Hongo was supposed to change that. Its location in the middle of nowhere meant isolation. Its guards were heavily armed, trained, and constantly monitored. Surveillance cameras and electronic systems covered every angle. The message was clear. Here, there would be no more escapes, no more chaos, no more cartel control. But the reality inside soon told a different story. In Mexico, the cartel's power does not stop at the prison gates. Within months of opening, report cell phones, drugs, and weapons found their way into the hands of inmates, smuggled by corrupt guards or sneaked in through intimidation and bribery. In a country where prison staff are poorly paid and often targeted by threats against their families, the cartel's influence seeped into even the tightest cracks. What was supposed to be a fortress became another battlefield. Rival gangs inside El Hongo continued their wars from behind bars. Cell blocks turned into territories, and disputes escalated into massacres. In one notorious riot, dozens were killed in a single day. The fighting was savage, involving knives, firearms, and even makeshift bombs. Guards, though armed with rifles, found themselves overwhelmed. Military forces had to be deployed to reestablish order, a grim reminder that even behind steel and stone, the cartels could not be contained. For the average prisoner, someone without cartel ties or protection, El Hongo was a place of constant fear. Extortion was rampant. Inmates were forced to pay rent to gangs simply to avoid being stabbed or beaten. Families on the outside were pressured to send money, smuggle contraband, or risk their loved one's life. Even visits became tools of exploitation, where relatives were threatened or coerced into helping gangs maintain their grip inside the walls. El Hongo's story reflects the wider truth about Mexico's war on drugs. No matter how advanced the technology, no matter how high the walls, corruption corrodes everything. The prison became a reflection of the state itself. Between them lie prisons like Bangkok and Carandiru, where overcrowding and neglect eroded humanity one day at a time, and places like Diyarbakir, where cruelty was orchestrated from the top down as an instrument of politics. Each of these prisons, though unique in location and method, reveals a single theme. Prisons are not only cages for criminals, they are mirrors of power itself. In some prisons, power manifests as absolute control. Guards monitor every breath, every blink, every step, ensuring no fragment of freedom remains. At Black Dolphin, the state declares shadows of themselves. Here, danger does not roar, it whispers, eroding the spirit until identity dissolves. Order becomes a cage tighter than iron, proof that cruelty can exist without chaos. In others, power is defined by its absence. In La Sabaneta, the government abandoned its role entirely, leaving prisoners to forge their own brutal hierarchies. Gangs became kings, weapons became law, and death became routine. Here, danger thrives not because of control, but because of the vacuum left by it. The state's neglect turned punishment into a free-for-all, where justice was not served but devoured. Sometimes the state does return, but when it does, it may wield violence as recklessly as the criminals it seeks to contain. Carandiru showed this in the most horrifying way. The massacre of 111 inmates was not justice, but slaughter masquerading as law. Overcrowding and corruption had allowed chaos to fester for years, and when it erupted, the response was not reform, but bullets. In that moment, the prison reflected not criminality, but the fragility of a society unwilling to confront its failures until they bled out in front of the world. Meanwhile, Bangkok represents the cruelty of erosion rather than explosion. There, suffering is measured not in sudden massacres, but in decades of despair. Chains that clink endlessly, heat that suffocates day and night, and hopeless sentences that grind men into dust. Danger here is not spectacular. It is slow, relentless, and invisible. And Diyarbakir reminds us that prisons are not always about crime. They can be turned into violent prisons. And a government obsessed with control builds prisons that function not as correctional facilities, but as factories of despair. When we look at the world's most dangerous prisons, we are not only peering into cell blocks of despair, we are staring into the mirror of civilization itself. A prison does not exist in isolation. It is born of the society that funds it, runs it, and looks the other way when cruelty festers inside. The horrors of Black Dolphin, Bangkok, Diyarbakir, La Sabaneta, Carandiru, and El Hongo are not just stories of inmates and guards. They are stories of nations, of governments, of entire cultures grappling with crime, punishment, and power. Consider Russia's Black Dolphin. It is more than a prison. It is an extension of the state's obsession with control. Every rule, every posture, every restriction on rest reflects a system that values order over humanity. The inmates, murderers, cannibals, terrorists, may deserve punishment, but the form that punishment takes tells us something about the society itself. That dominance is enforced not only over actions but over identity, until men no longer belong even to themselves. Then look at Venezuela's La Sabaneta. Here the government's neglect gave rise to chaos so complete that the prison became a miniature failed state. Gangs ruled, guards fled, and survival depended on weapons and fear. This was not just a reflection of the prison, but of Venezuela's wider instability, corruption, poverty, and violence bleeding from the streets into the cells. La Sabaneta was not an accident. It was a symptom of a nation unraveling. Thailand's Bangkok, with its leg irons and suffocating overcrowding, mirrors a society that treats offenders not as humans but as disposable. Drug offenders, some hardened traffickers, others unlucky foreigners, fill half the cells. The prison's cruelty lies not in sudden massacres but in decades of despair, where time itself becomes the harshest sentence. Here we see a justice system that equates punishment with degradation, stripping men of dignity as surely as chains strip them of comfort. Brazil's Carandiru speaks to the peril of ignoring problems until they explode. Years of overcrowding, neglect, and disease turn the prison into a powder keg. That prisons cannot rise above the culture that surrounds them. And Diyarbakir? It remains perhaps the most chilling lesson. There, prison was not about crime at all. It was a weapon of political power, used to erase language, culture, and identity. Its cruelty was not chaotic but calculated, proving how dangerous a prison becomes when it ceases to serve justice and instead becomes an instrument of oppression. Together, these prisons show us that the measure of a society is not in its skyscrapers, its armies, or its wealth, but in how it treats those it locks away. The cells we build reflect the values we hold, or fail to hold. When cruelty, neglect, corruption, or repression define a prison, they also define the society that allows it. We have journeyed through prisons that embody extremes. Icy fortresses of silence, collapsing jungles of chaos, overcrowded tombs of despair, and laboratories of repression. Each one was terrifying in its own way, yet together they reveal something larger, something unavoidable. Prisons are mirrors. They reflect not only the people inside them, but the societies that build and sustain them. At Black Dolphin in Russia, we saw a state obsessed with absolute control, where order becomes cruelty and even rest is forbidden. At Bangkok in Thailand, we saw suffering doled out not in sudden bursts of violence, but in the slow erosion of humanity by heat, chains, and overcrowding. At Diyarbakir in Turkey, we saw how prisons can be twisted into political weapons, where torture and humiliation serve not justice, but domination. At La Sabaneta in Venezuela, we saw the terrifying void left when authority collapses entirely, and men turn on each other in a kingdom of knives and blood. At Carandiru in Brazil, we witnessed what happens when years of neglect explode in a single massacre that stains a nation's conscience. And at El Hongo in Mexico, we saw that even the strongest walls cannot hold back corruption when cartels wield power as great as the state itself. These prisons force us to confront a chilling truth. The true danger of a prison is not only the brutality within its walls, but what that brutality says about the civilization. A violent culture breeds violent prisons. Do we demand justice, or do we accept cruelty as normal? Do we push for reform, or do we look away until neglect becomes massacre? Do we see prisoners as human beings, or as shadows to be erased? How a society treats its prisoners is how it treats its people. The cruelty of a prison system echoes outward, shaping the streets, the laws, the culture. If prisons are cages of despair, they are also warnings. Warnings that the line between justice and cruelty, between order and oppression, is thinner than we imagine. And so we end where we began. Prisons are not sanctuaries. They are reflections. And sometimes, when we dare to look closely, what stares back at us is darker than any cell, any chain, or any wall.